The USSR's Sputnik and Vostok programs had been wildly successful and culminated in sending astronaut Yuri Gagarin into space in 1961. That same year, the Berlin Wall rose, and the United States was making preparations for the Vietnam War. Terror, anger, pain, war, danger, division, these feelings ruled the day. It was in the midst of this tempest into which President Kennedy spoke words forever immortalized in the hearts and minds of anyone who's ever stared into the clear night sky considering the heavens.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
In the midst of terror, hope, in the midst of fear,
an act of faith and vision, for we do not now know what benefits await us.
In the midst of turmoil, Kennedy believed in the unseen. His words of faith were, to some, lunacy, to others, galvanizing vision, and to us, 60 years in the future, prophecy. For not only did Kennedy's miracle come to pass, but it succeeded in such blinding fashion so as to mark the world forever.
So last week we started this series called On the Moon, and we're kind of running some parallels here with the moon landing and what this looks like for us as Christians and what it means for us as we move forward. So last week we talked about the Last Supper on the moon and the fact that they had communion as the first supper on the moon, right? And how important that was. And so today we're talking about a little bit of some harder things for us to deal with. So part of the reason, Kennedy says there is that we're going to the moon, not because it's easy, because it's hard. There are hard things that we have to do in life that help us to get someplace more productive, right? There are hard things that we have to do, we have to face. And so that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit today. And so today is all about the gift of rejection. Let's talk about rejection for just a minute. Could it be that when we're rejected in life, or when we feel rejected, or we feel that all too familiar taste of disappointment, of being picked over, being looked over, being forgotten, when we feel like we've been rejected? Is it possible that in those moments that we've been handed a strangely wrapped present? So today we're going to be looking at John chapter 4. So if you have your Bibles with you, you can turn to John chapter 4 with us. It will be on the screen also. We're going to read through the whole little section here, and then we're going to draw some different conclusions from it. So John chapter 4, we're going to start in verse 43. It says, "After the 2 days he left for Galilee. Now Jesus himself had pointed out that a prophet has no honor in his own country. When he arrived in Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him. They had seen all that he had done in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, for they had also been there. Once more he visited Cana in Galilee, where he had turned the water into wine. And there was a certain royal official whose son lay sick at Capernaum. When this man heard that Jesus had arrived in Galilee from Judea, he went to him and begged him to come and heal his son, who was close to death. 'Unless you people see signs and wonders,' Jesus told him, 'you will never believe.' The royal official said, 'Sir, come down before my child dies.' 'Go,' Jesus replied, 'your son will live.' The man took Jesus at his word and departed. While he was still on the way, his servants met him with the news that his boy was living. When he inquired as to the time when his son got better, they said to him, 'Yesterday at 1 PM, the fever left him.' Then the father realized that this was the exact time at which Jesus had said to him, 'Your son will live.' So he and his whole household believed. This was the second sign Jesus performed after coming from Judea to Galilee." So, this strangely wrapped gift of rejection. Rejection can be pretty hard on us, right? We usually find this out sometime in childhood. Maybe we realize that we're not the most athletic, or we're not the best reader, or that we struggle with something that others seem to do so effortlessly. Those rejections are really hard at the time, but they can help us to find the things that we really enjoy. Right? Maybe some of you have been there. My brother has a situation like this. He has pretty severe dyslexia, and as a kid, it took them a really long time to even figure out that he had dyslexia, because he couldn't describe it. Nobody else was picking up on it. And all throughout elementary school, he really, really struggled to read, which meant that he struggled not only for reading, but also for math comprehension, the paragraph ones you have to do, for science, anything. So he really struggled in school and really needed some extra help in processing and learning those things. And my brother is incredibly smart. I mean, he's really gifted in some other ways. But through childhood, this was something that was really hard on him, and people treated him so differently because of it. But I gotta tell you, my brother is one of the best mechanics, one of the best machinists that there is. He is incredibly gifted with his hands and blows my mind with what he can do. But if he hadn't have struggled so much in this area, he might not have found that out. Because when he struggled so much with this, with school, with reading, he used the gifts that God had given him in other ways. He figured out ways to make other things work. And in doing so, he found out the things he loves. His company that he works for even paid for him to go to school, to get trained and certified and all these things, because they recognized from the beginning that he was capable of doing these things, that he knew what he was talking about. So they paid for him to go to school so that he would be higher qualified within their company. Rejection can be a gift. When we look at this text, there are some different things that we're going to be pointing out here. And in particular, Jesus had an appointment with a man who has a terrible need in his life, right? His child is dying. And so we're going to look at rejection, but as we do, we're also going to talk about some other words that fall into place with it. So if you're taking notes and things like that, you should keep track of the big words. All right. So the first word that we're going to actually talk about is the word reception. Reception. And that's because it comes up some in this text. You see, it says that Jesus ended up doing ministry where they received him. And that's important for us to remember. It's an important distinction to make because it explicitly says he did not remain in Judea, nor did he go back to his hometown of Nazareth, but instead he chose to Galilee, and specifically within Galilee to Cana, because the Galileans received him. Last week, remember we talked about the wedding at Cana, right? This is where he's been before. This is where people have witnessed some things taking place. And so the Galileans are there ready to receive him. He's been invited. We talked last week about the importance of inviting him to be a part of our lives, inviting him to go to work with us, to be a part of our marriages, to be a part of the situations that surround us. In all of this, Jesus didn't go to Nazareth, and he didn't stay in Judea. And why is that? Well, he says specifically, a prophet is not without honor except in his own hometown. Where was Jesus born? He was born in Judea, in Bethlehem, in his hometown was Nazareth. Nazareth and Judea tended to be the most difficult ministry assignments that Jesus had. The places that he had the most access were also the most inhospitable, because he grew up there. You know, it even happened like this. It's not like he didn't want to. It's not like he didn't try. But matter of fact, he showed up in Nazareth at the synagogue, and they handed the scroll of Isaiah to him. And he read the prophecies out loud about himself. And he closes the scroll, and he says, these words are being fulfilled right now. The Spirit of God is upon me. God is about to work. And what did they do? In Luke 4:29, it says they jumped up and mobbed him. They forced him to the edge of the hill on which the town was built. They intended to push him over the cliff. They wanted nothing to do with him. The place Jesus grew up in had no room for him becoming who God had built him to be. There was this sense of, we've known you your whole life, so what makes you better than us? We know your brothers. We know where you're from. We know your dad, Joseph. We saw you in the carpenter shop. Now you're going to do God's work? Sometimes it's hard staying in your hometown. Some of you understand this because you've lived in Canton your whole life. And you may have faced this. You see, it threatened them. And they viewed themselves somehow as being less than if he became something. There'll be times in your life when people try and drag you down, people that you think should be building you up, and they don't. They feel like they pull the rug out from under you. And that's because misery at times loves company. But when you hold back, what does that do? When you hold back on what God has called you to do, when you hold back on who you are, what does that really do? All right. So, he goes from Nazareth. He goes to Galilee because he's welcome there. But before he leaves, let's this is just a side note right here, right quick. So before he leaves, as he's on his way out of town where he's not welcome, he still heals people. He still takes care of their needs on the way out the door. And that's a bad day in Jesus' ministry. Can you imagine that, being a part of a bad day of Jesus' ministry? I mean, that's still a pretty good day, right? I mean, how cool is it to think that this reveals what Jesus' priority is, right? So, the one thing that we tend to make the main thing was actually an afterthought. Not that helping people and healing sick bodies and feeding hungry people is unimportant, because those are very, very important, right? That's how we show God's love. But Jesus only ever did the physical things to help speak to the heart. It was the miracle on the inside. Healing someone with a withered hand, that's awesome. Healing someone with leprosy, giving their life back to them, that's epic. But healing someone's heart was always going to be the main focus of Jesus' ministry. Because anybody that he healed when he walked the earth is dead now, right? They're dead. But anybody that he healed in their heart is still alive. So, this is his priority. It wasn't his miracles. It wasn't wonderfully inspiring sermons. But his priority was to save people. That's what he was there for, to die and be resurrected. So, Nazareth. He's leaving there. He's heading out to Galilee. And on the way, he actually stops in Samaria. That's where he meets the woman at the well. He, talks to her, saves her. She starts telling everyone about this. And in doing so, it starts a revival where they had this whole thing going on for 2 days. They wanted Jesus to stay longer, but he was like, no, I've got somewhere else to be. So that's where our passage of scripture starts. It says, and so after the 2 days, that's those 2 days in Samaria, where he has been greeted and welcomed. And again, this is at a place where Samaria is not a fan of the Jews, right? There's racial tension, yet Jesus was welcomed there. So, he goes from there to Galilee. Now, we see that he doesn't go to Capernaum where typically most people would have gone. He goes to Cana. But while he's there in Cana, there's a man from Capernaum who comes, right? He busts in the door, and here's our next word that we get, is desperation. He busts in the doors because he needs to see Jesus. His son is dying. He says, my son is at the point of death. And it's interesting because Jesus doesn't say a whole lot right then, does he? He doesn't say a whole lot. He kind of has this little short conversation with this guy. Now, this guy is a royal official, right? So he probably works in Herod's house. And he may even be a relative of Herod at the time. And he says, you won't believe unless you see it. So we've got another word that comes in here. Frustration. Jesus is slightly frustrated at the fact that here he is, this guy just wants to see what he's going to do. You see, Herod had been like this also. Herod had been wanting to see Jesus do his miracles, but not in a sense of, I want to see, God's power. It's more like he wanted to watch the magic show. Herod really didn't like Jesus. Herod didn't want anything to do with that. He just wanted to see the show. And so when this official busts in and he says, my son's to the point of death, Jesus at first has this frustration of, man, y'all just will do anything, won't you? Just do anything. But that's the thing. Jesus didn't come to do magic tricks or anything like that, right? No. So in this moment, when the man comes to ask him to do something, he was responding to the popular sentiment that had put Jesus on this man's radar. You guys just want to see a miracle. You don't want anything to actually do with me. You just want me to do things for you. You don't actually want me. The man, in response to Jesus' frustration, could have just huffed away. He could have said, you know what, I'll find somebody else, or he could have just left feeling like it was worthless. He could have. But Jesus was giving him an opportunity here. He was giving him an opportunity to be offended. To be offended. Because in reality, the gospel is always bitter on the outside and sweet on the inside. Do you understand what I mean by that? Being bitter on the outside. See, if we're looking at the scriptures from the outside, it looks like it's just a whole bunch of rules that we don't necessarily want to follow or change or do. But if we understand the meaning and the intent and the purpose, and we hear God's heart in it, we realize how much sweeter it is. Sin is sweet on the outside, but all it is bitter on the inside. But the thing is, the man didn't get offended. He actually doubles down. Because the man changes what he says, and he says, "Please come with me." He says, "My dear child is dying." Now, I'm going to point out to you real quick that this particular phrasing uses a different Greek word than what it just did a couple of verses before that. The first time it was just, "My son is sick and at the point of death." Now the second time when he says this, he's calling him his baby boy. "Please come down with me." So we have the desperation and the frustration working together. Jesus gave him an opportunity to show his heart and where he's at. So at this point, we see the man is serious, right? That he's got this heartfelt need, this desperate plea. And so this is where normally we're like, "All right, Jesus, go do your thing," right? But that's not what happens. The guy just invited Jesus to come to his house, to come and see his son, to come be there. And Jesus says, no. He says, "No, your son is fine. Just go home." His request was, "Come to me. Come put your hand on him and heal him. Come with me." And see, the thing is, the whole walk is that this guy would be able to tell you about him, right? He'd be able to tell someone about this child of his, what they like, what their name is, what's wrong, what happened, why the fever hasn't broke, what they've tried. But he just says, "No, just go on. He's fine." So we end up with a rejection. Jesus rejected the man's request, ultimately giving him something he didn't ask for. He gives him something he didn't ask for. And what was the man's response? Submission. Submission. He did just like Miss Judy said you should do. God tells you to do something, you do it. He submitted. He did exactly what Jesus said, and he walked home. It's 22 miles from Capernaum to Cana. He'd already walked it once that day to get to Jesus, and he was going to walk 22 miles back home. We're talking, hours and hours and hours of walking, and when it gets dark, you got to stay somewhere because you don't have a flashlight. It's just not something you do at night. You don't travel in the dark, so you'd have to stay somewhere, and then you start again the next morning. And so he goes, and he does this, and then when he gets home, his servants meet him out in the front of the house. It says, "Your boy lives." The exact word that Jesus gave him. Your boy lives. Your boy lives. And when did he get better? Yesterday at the exact time that Jesus said, "Go, he lives." The exact time he said, "Your son lives." But in his submission, in those 22 miles, he had to walk in faith, taking Jesus at his word. That's a long time To be wondering and still unsure of the outcome and wondering if, in fact, your child is alive because this one guy says he lives. That's a long time to walk by yourself, to process by yourself, to think by yourself, and to feel helpless by yourself. But this guy took Jesus at his word. So many times we want to see in order to believe, but Jesus has always said, "Blessed are you if you believe even when you haven't seen." And in doing so, in walking that 22 miles alone to get back home to find out that his boy lives, he was given another gift: salvation. Jesus' rejection of not coming with him opened a door for salvation. The man got to see the miracle he didn't ask for, but he also got to see one he didn't even know he needed. He and his whole household got saved. And that's the miracle to pray for. That those we love would be saved. And it all happened because of rejection. At the end of the story, this man got to walk away with something that I'm praying that as we go through life, that we will continue to look for, that we will evaluate and look for. And that was a vision. You see, 2020 vision is where we look back on something, right? That hindsight. When we look back on something and say, man, that was really tough, but man, I can look back and see how God was there, how God moved, how God answered, how even though that may have been a no or a rejection or whatever it was, that because I looked back, I can see how God has changed. I can see the additional blessings that I didn't even know I needed in those times. The man was able to see those things. You know, we have been talking about the Apollo 11 experience here. We have Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin are the most commonly ones that we talk about in this situation, right? Buzz Aldrin led the communion on the moon. Neil Armstrong got to be the first one to take that step. But there was a third astronaut there. Does anybody know his name? Just wondering, right? Again, it's not one that we talk about all the time, but his name was Michael Collins. Michael Collins, he was the third member of the Apollo 11 crew. Buzz Aldrin took communion on the moon. Neil Armstrong got to walk on the moon. But Michael Collins was also a part of the mission. And interestingly, Collins was the only living human being that was a part of it, that wanted to watch it, that didn't get to. You see, 500 million people on earth tuned in to watch. 500 million people tuned in to watch or listen on the radio of the first thing to take place, right? Anybody that wanted to, that, you know, within the civilized world, as far as not being like in a jungle or something like that, anybody that wanted to see it got to be a part of it. They got to hear it. But Collins could not watch, and he could not listen. And ironically, he was the one closer to the two of them, right? He was right there. But see, Collins was on the back side of the moon, the dark side of the moon, where no radio reception could receive him, and he was in complete and total radio blackout. How crazy is it, the one person alive who couldn't watch and listen to what everyone had been waiting for was the closest one there. I pray that that's never the case with us, that may those of us who have seen and heard always be seeing and hearing what Jesus is doing and excited to see it extended to new places and new people. But let's talk a little bit more about Collins here. Because this goes further than just not being able to see or hear or be a part of it. But the thing is he didn't belong in Apollo 11. He was never supposed to be there. He was rostered to be a part of the crew of Apollo 8. Apollo 8 was the crew that was to circle the moon, to be there and just circle it and come back home. That's where Michael Collins was supposed to be. But something happened to his spine. There was a degenerative disease that caused a breakdown between the 6th and 7th cervix. And his legs went numb inexplicably one day. He couldn't feel them in hot or cold water. He couldn't feel the calf muscle. So he went in to get an x-ray, and they found out that there was a problem with his spine. And they said, unless we fix it, you'll never even be able to be ejected out of a fighter plane again. You can never do any of this. The Air Force will ground you. NASA will ground you. You're off this mission. So he was heartbroken because the diagnosis meant that he couldn't participate in going to the moon. His words when the diagnosis came out, he said, I had been dropped from the crew as soon as the necessity for my operation had become apparent. Dropped, he said, like a hot potato. Rejected. They had to do surgery, taking a piece of bone from his hip and installing it in his neck, hoping that it would strengthen and be able to clear him for flight again. But he honestly had no hope of this happening. And then it did. They said, we have a mission for you. You're not going to be a part of Apollo 8. Sorry about that. But you are going to be a part of Apollo 11. You're going to go down in history as one of the 3 who got to be a part of the manned landing on the moon. How? Because of rejection. And don't we have so many more stories like that? I mean, think about other people that we can name where their lives changed drastically because of rejection, and they did something else. I mean, Steve Jobs is one of those, right? He was originally fired from Apple, but he says that was one of the best things that ever happened to them, because otherwise he wouldn't have started Pixar, only to come back and own Apple again. What about Tom Brady? He was the 199th draft pick. That's pretty far down that list. When we think about his draft bio, talking about how sickly and weak he was and how he couldn't throw, but look at him now, right? Love him or hate him, you gotta see what he's done, right? I mean, it's there. The point is, in our life, sometimes when it's hard to see it, and it's hard when we have to face it, but we're in the middle of it, we've got to still call on Jesus. We've got to still reach out and praise him for what he's doing in the midst of it. Because there's a gift inside rejection. There's a gift inside rejection. God is moving and working. He has a plan, and he's always up to something in our life. My journey to be a pastor started with rejection. My plan was to go to the moon, or somewhere similar. Now, I'm not saying that I'm a gift to you by any means, but being a pastor has been a gift to me. Being able to let God use me in a way that I didn't imagine has been a gift for me. So this morning, as we go into our closing song here, what are things that we need to turn over to God? What are things that we need to let Him have? Because maybe the gift is coming out of it.
I spend so